Welcome. This lecture is on Hitler and World War II. It is disturbing that a single evil man could cause such devastation that would shake the globe, causing much pain and suffering in most nations of the world. Almost unbelievably, the scale of warfare in World War II dwarfed that of the Great War. Only 11 nations in the world were not directly involved. We know much of Adolf Hitler's twisted mind from the wreckage that played out on multiple continents and from his own writings 15 years before the start of World War II. In 1924, Hitler began serving a prison sentence for his involvement with other National Socialists in the attempted coup of the government of Bavaria. As leader of the National German Socialist Workers' Party, Hitler received a sentence of 5 years. However, he served less than 1 year in prison. This was enough time for him to write his rambling Mein Kampf, which outlined his political thinking that guaranteed violence. Publication of the two-volume project was in 1925 and 1926. In Mein Kampf, readers learned of Hitler's alignment with socialist thinking and religious paganism. His opposition to free market capitalism and Christianity put Germany on a dangerous road. A close reading of his writing reveals that Hitler's racist ideology was bound to lead to war. Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889, in Upper Austria. Baptized and raised as a Roman Catholic, Hitler sang in a choir of the monastery church, and he looked favorably on the possible vocation as an abbot, seeing this position as one representing the highest ideal. He wrote of the magnificent splendor of ecclesiastical ceremony, but his interest in the church as a vocation was temporary. When discussing his boyhood years, he gave no mention of Christ or a gospel message of sin and salvation. Hitler's father was a civil servant who wanted his son to do likewise. Hitler resisted his father's pressure and at the age of 12 decided his career path would be painting. The death of his father the following year and the loss of his mother 3 years later left the 15-year-old Hitler to fend for himself without much money, since his mother's illness used up much of the family's meager resources. Hitler's aversion to regular labor and his tendency to dream of the past glories of German history explains his lack of success seeking and keeping employment. Hitler moved to Vienna, determined to be a successful artist, and the first step was the Academy of Fine Arts, where he applied for entrance. His failure to pass the entrance examination struck him like a bolt from the skies, but later he wrote, "The goddess of fate clutched me in her hands and often threatened to smash me, but the will grew stronger as the obstacles increased, and finally the will triumphed." It was not unusual for Hitler to blend Christian and pagan rhetoric. He embraced the image of the hero, one who was courageous, full of energy, having great foresight and confidence of purpose. Life in Vienna was harsh, and Hitler experienced years of poverty while he pursued his architectural studies. In fact, he occasionally went hungry. As he experienced economic insecurity, he concluded that Vienna's bourgeois class had little contact and genuine sympathy for the working class. Hitler claimed he witnessed thousands of cases when workers who left the country for the mammoth city that greedily attracts men fell victim to harsh economic urban life. Addressing the life of a worker, Hitler wrote, He has been so often thrown out of employment through no fault of his own that he is now more or less indifferent whether the strike in which he takes part be for the purpose of securing his economic rights or be aimed at the destruction of the state, the whole social order, and even civilization itself. Hitler was not only critical of the bourgeois, the housing conditions of workers was appalling. In language, echoing Frederick Engels, he pointed to the quote, loathsome filth and wickedness, end of quote, of the miserable urban slums. According to Hitler, Vienna and the Austrian state lacked a quote, sense of social rights or social legislation to improve social conditions. At age 17, Hitler had no feelings of opposition to the Marxist policy of the Social Democratic Party. Cloaking its Marxist ideology, the Social Democrat Party adopted its name to have broader appeal in Germany. Hitler favored the party mainly for its support for the working class, but his enthusiasm lessened when he learned that the party was hostile to a strong German presence in Austria and supportive of the demands of Slavs. Hitler began reading Marx's daily papers and had further reason to be critical of these publications that twisted facts and presented them in, quote, a deceptive form. Although he opposed the type of socialists who did not champion the racial superiority of the German people, he learned much from his reading on how journalists could sway the masses with cleverly written propaganda. He understood how the Marxists were able to gain influence. Quote, our bourgeois parties can never repair the damage resulted from the mistakes they then made, for they sowed the seeds of hatred when they opposed all efforts at social reform, and thus they gave at least apparent grounds to justify the claim put forward by the Social Democrats, namely that they alone stood up for the interest of the working class. Like the Marxists, Hitler gave no credence to the argument that a worker experiencing workplace injustice was free to leave. In his mind, this demonstrated the powerlessness rather than the strength of the worker. The act of leaving employment because of grievances was no real solution to the individual or the nation. Hitler asked, quote, is it or is it not in the interest of the nation to remove the causes of social unrest? End of quote. Given his support for the working class, Hitler sought to understand the dynamics of the trade unions. He discovered there were two components: trade unionism that defended the social rights of workers and fought for improved living conditions, and the trade unionism that politically advanced Marxist causes. When employers did not act properly, it was necessary to defend workers. So long, quote, so long as there are employers who attack social understanding and have wrong ideas of justice and fair play, it is not only the right, but also the duty of their employees, who are, after all, an integral part of our people, to protect the general interests against the greed and unreason of the individual. End of quote. The best chance of winning for the individual worker was when he entered a group with other workers and presented a united front against the employer who incorporated, quote, in his own person, the mass strength of the vested interest in the industrial or commercial undertaking which he conducts, end of quote. Hitler was for the working class, but on nationalist terms rather than Marxist terms. The Social Democrats, blinded by their Marxist ideology, failed to respect and uphold trade unionism's historic role for protecting workers. Hitler argued that the transition unfolded for mostly political advantage. He wrote, within a few decades of the trade union movement was transformed by the expert hand of social democracy from an instrument which has been originally fashioned for the defense of human rights into an instrument of the destruction of the national economic structure, end of quote. Because both the National Socialists and Communists sought the allegiance of workers, they became implacable foes. The topic of Jews did not enter in Hitler's early discussion of defending workers. For the first 13 years of his life, he never heard the word Jew at home. He claimed that his father tended to be cosmopolitan, someone unlikely to single out Jews for criticism. Hitler had no negative opinion of one Jewish student he knew at school. He viewed Jews as Germans and saw no reason to treat them. He wrote, quote, "As I thought that they were persecuted on account of their faith, my aversion to hearing remarks against them grew almost into a feeling of abhorrence. I did not in the least suspect that there could be such a thing as systematic anti-Semitism," end of quote. 2 years later, after great, quote, internal conflict, Hitler changed his position and began to see the Jews as, in his words, a moral pestilence. He believed that Jews had too much control in art, literature, theater, and the media. He wrote that scales fell from my eyes when he discovered that the leaders of the social democracy were Jews. Convinced that Jews were in control of other Marxist organizations, he believed that Jews used Marxism as a vehicle for control of the world. It is impossible to know if Hitler's account of his racist journey is credible. In the early part of Mein Kampf, he built the argument that he was fair-minded about the Jews, only changing his position when rational analysis presented him with no choice in the matter. Certainly, this interpretation that he was won over by rationalism was self-serving. In Hitler's evil thinking, God guided his anti-Semitism. He wrote, "I believe today that my conduct is in accordance with the will of the Almighty Creator in standing guard against the Jew. I am defending the handiwork of the Lord." End of quote. Such blasphemous statements came easy for Hitler. He continued to see himself as a Catholic, and he publicly said so as late as 1933. His warped understanding of Christianity continued, as did his speeches, with the words God, the Almighty, and Providence. However, in 1937, he distanced himself from Christianity, writing that the decision gave him energy. Quote, "Now I feel as fresh as a colt in the pasture," end of quote. Historian Max de Moraes identifies Hitler's God as a mythical one who chose him to lead the German state by military action to a new glory. The God in whom Hitler believed was the particularly German God whose name was inscribed on the belt buckles of both the old and new German army. It was the God who let iron grow and wanted no slaves, who therefore armed the Germans with saber, sword, and spear. In April 1938, and on other occasions, Hitler stated, quote, "I believed it was God's will that from here, Austria, a boy was sent into the Reich, allowing to mature and elevate it to become the nation's Führer," end of quote. Throughout the 1920s, Hitler, with his racism and heroic pagan ideas, had tapped into the anger of German workers. The National Socialists became a strong presence, stealing votes of many workers who had earlier supported the communists and other political parties. When Germany faced economic depression in 1930 and the early years of the decade, the National Socialists surpassed the communists in strength. In July 1932, they won 196 seats out of approximately 560 plus seats in the Reichstag, which is the German parliament. On January 30th, 1933, Hitler became chancellor and the Nazis were in control. He gained dictatorial power within a few weeks and began to build his war machines, making steady gains each year. Factory production of guns, ammunition, and equipment generated numerous jobs for workers. He increasingly gained support by promoting the sense of belonging to the folk. The people Hitler spoke of, however, were Aryan. His race theory saw no place in Germany for non-Aryans. In March 1936, Hitler sent troops into the demilitarized zone of the Rhineland. It was a crucial act of territorial aggression. Had France and Britain, or even France alone, stood strong, Hitler would have lost. He was still unprepared for victory. With his major gamble paying off, Hitler proceeded to build the Siegfried Line of strong fortifications on Germany's western frontier. The whole military and diplomatic situation in Western Europe had changed. France was more vulnerable, and Germany was in a stronger position to defend itself. There was celebration throughout Germany. Hitler's political intuition was vindicated, his expert military critics silenced. In July, civil war broke out in Spain between Republicans and fascists led by General Francisco Franco. Hitler used the war as an opportunity to test his new weapons in support of Franco. He also made better relations with the Italian fascist Benito Mussolini. Thus was the beginning of what Hitler termed the Rome-Berlin axis. In March 1938, Hitler sent his troops into Austria, thus confirming the German union with Austria. It was a clear violation of the Treaty of Versailles, but both Great Britain and France failed to enforce its provisions. Germany now surrounded Czechoslovakia on three sides. An invasion of Czechoslovakia came in March of 1939. The National Socialists shocked the world when they announced in August 1939 the signing of a neutrality pact with the Soviet Union. This paved the way for Hitler's conquest of Poland by removing the threat of Soviet retaliation from the East. On September the 1st, Hitler invaded Poland. War had come to Europe and then to the world. While countries such as Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France fell to the Germans, only the miracle of Dunkirk in late May and early June 1940 allowed the British to remain in the fight. With the assistance of fishing boats and yachts, the British Expeditionary Force had escaped the continent at the northeastern port of Dunkirk. Nazi planes pounded away at England in the Battle of Britain, but Hitler made his first major mistake when he switched from strategic bombing to the more terror-oriented assault of the Blitz. Displaying characteristic grit, Prime Minister Winston Churchill and the British held out. Hitler's racist ideology and the goal of conquering living space for Aryans drove him to attack the USSR. Hitler left England unconquered. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union as part of Operation Barbarossa in June of 1941, it looked grim for the Soviets. Hitler was confident that his forces overmatched what he perceived were the inferior races of the East. At first, the Russian campaign looked like blitzkrieg at its finest, with the German army chewing up hundreds of miles of territory and closing in on Moscow and Leningrad. A stiffening Russian resistance and the arrival of General Winter froze the Germans in their track just shy of their goals. Victory remained maddeningly out of reach. The problem was that the Germans had now forced the Soviet Union, a country with a large population and industrial potential, directly into the fray. Obviously, the situation became much more dire for the National Socialists with the arrival of a certified industrial giant, the United States. With the surprise Japanese attack on the American base at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the United States was at war with Japan and Germany. At this point, the war became a matter of production, and the Germans could never keep pace with the Americans. Otto von Bismarck's saying decades earlier about blood and iron took on an even greater meaning. The United States joined Britain and the Soviet Union in mobilizing their entire societies to the war effort. American production surpassed that of all its enemies combined. German defeat at Stalingrad in February 1943 turned the tide of the war. Gradually, the National Socialists were turned back on the Eastern Front, and in Italy, where they took over the main burden of defense after the Anglo-American invasion of Italy in 1943. The Allied invasion at Normandy in June of 1944, so long desired by Joseph Stalin, sealed Germany's doom. At Yalta, the West control of France and Italy was tacitly acknowledged, the principles of zones of occupation for Germany accepted, and temporary agreement on Poland achieved. The days of the evil one were numbered. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler committed suicide and the Germans surrendered a week later. Hitler was dead, but chaos continued for several months. In Asia, war dated back to 1931 and had been fought on a full-scale basis since 1937. By 1941, Japan found itself in the difficult position of being trapped in a bloody stalemate in China that left it no closer to victory than it had been 4 years earlier. A tightening American embargo on oil left Japan with a limited window of opportunity for carving off its empire. The attack on Pearl Harbor was designed to buy the Japanese enough time to solidify their conquest in the Pacific while the U.S. rebuilt their navy. To the surprise of the Japanese, the American victory at Midway in June 1942 quickly turned the tide of battle in the Pacific. A tortuous process of island hopping slowly shrank the Japanese empire. In early 1945, the U.S. won bloody battles at Iwo Jima and Nakanawa and was within striking distance of Japan itself. The war ended with the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945. Hitler's evil spawned horrific events. One of the great horrible constants of both military life and civilian life in World War II was continual bombing, ranging from high explosives to the V-2 rockets and the atomic bomb. On a much greater scale than in the Great War, cities and civilian populations were important targets, both to destroy infrastructure and terrorize the populace. Shanghai, Warsaw, Dresden, London, Tokyo, and of course, Hiroshima and Nagasaki all underwent intensive bombing. Occupation by the Axis power almost always followed military conquest. It was common for the National Socialists to exploit the conquered civilian population as virtual slave laborers. Many members of the occupied country served as resistance fighters, while others collaborated with the Nazis. The worst example of treatment meted out to a conquered people was obviously the Holocaust. Hitler's perception of the Jews took on an all-encompassing racial hatred that bordered on madness. Persecution of the Jews by Hitler dated back to the early days of his reign with the Nuremberg laws and later Kristallnacht. Tragically, liberal Christians in Germany, ignoring the dire warnings of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, were supportive of Hitler's policy. The first mass execution of Eastern Jews occurred in 1939 with the invasion of Poland. Increasingly obsessed with his pursuit of the final solution, Hitler engineered the mass killing of Eastern European Jews when his armies invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. Envisioning the invasion as a holy war intent on destroying inferior races, the SS employed mobile murder squads. By the end of 1941, the SS had killed around 1.9 million Jews. At the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, a final solution to the Jewish question was reached. At concentration camps, Germans targeted the rich, the weak, the sick, the pregnant, and old for extermination. It soon became clear that even those allowed to live were only intended to serve the short-term needs of the Nazis. Within the camps, hard labor, starvation, disease, and death shaped the parameters of the Jewish experience. The National Socialists used gas chambers in the Soviet Union and Poland to exterminate Jews in mass. Concentrated in 5 major extermination camps, the Nazi genocide resulted in the murder of 6 million Jews. The criminal action of a warped man caused untold grief and horror for countless people. 50 million people, about half of whom were civilians, died during World War II. The personal, material, and psychological toll of war was devastating. Civilian populations suffered from starvation, disease, bombardment, executions, and terror. Mass abuse of women took place. In addition, the physical destructions of cities were extensive. Tallying up the impact of Hitler and the forces of Satan is a sickening venture. However, in the end, we are thankful that good prevailed over evil. Thank you.